We get hired to follow people for the smallest reasons, and sometimes end up watching the worst thing any of us could imagine. Real private eyes collect receipts. Receipts of betrayal, receipts of business fraud, receipts of small domestic lies. But every so often a tale that starts as paperwork turns into a night where you listen to someone else's life break. Those are the jobs that stay with you. I'm not here to be dramatic. I've been on both sides of the ledger, son of a patrol cop, later a PI for nearly 2 decades, so I know where the line between curiosity and complicity runs. What I want to do is tell you about the cases other private eyes, and I call the most terrifying. The ones that began as infidelity checks and ended with blood on the highway, the ones that exposed people preying on the homeless. The missing person job that smelled like something bigger and darker than a runaway. These aren't sensational headlines. They're the kinds of nights that make you rethink why you took the job. If you like true crime told by people who were there, subscribe and hit the bell. The first of these started like a lot of cases do. A ring at the office, a woman's voice that steadied when she said, "He's been leaving late, and he won't tell me where." She brought a photograph, a license plate, a make and model. She gave me a little money and told me she only wanted to know the truth, nothing more. Most of the time that means a motel, a restaurant, a colleague's house. Most tales end in a sigh, a quiet divorce, or a messy conversation at dinner. This one didn't end quietly. The subject was a man the file named Mark. I'd never met him, I didn't want to. The plan was standard. Daylight surveillance to get a routine, nighttime watching to confirm a pattern. I worked alone that week. No partner to trade glances with, no car full of radios. Just an aging sedan with tinted windows and the familiar smell of burnt coffee in the cup holder. I parked 2 blocks away from the house the first afternoon and watched him leave for work. He drove a pickup with a dented tailgate and a bumper sticker his wife had jokingly told me about in the intake. A faded outdoorsman sticker she said he'd had since before they married. There's an art to following a man through a town without making him look back. You keep distance. You change lanes at predictable times so it feels natural. You let him go when a highway splits, and you pick him up again at the next light. People feel watched more than they see watchers. That works to your advantage until it doesn't. 2 nights into the watch, he missed his usual turn. He was supposed to head toward the riverfront where his job was, but instead he turned onto a side road that peeled away from the busy part of town. I kept the distance, soft on the throttle, eyes on his tail lights. Heads turned toward him at red lights, but no one else followed. He pulled into a lot that backed onto a belt of trees and got out of his truck with 3 other men. They moved deliberately slow, the way people do when they don't want to be noticed, but know they already are. They ducked hoods over their heads and bundled things that looked at first like tools, rakes, maybe heavy branches. They were wearing dark clothes, and one of them had something strapped to his back that might have been an axe handle. My stomach tightened in a way I hadn't felt since an early night on detail years before. I thought, this is either a hunting party that forgot to tell anyone, or it's a bad movie. They walked toward the trees. I followed at a distance, keeping my lights off, parking where the gravel made the least noise. You learn to move your car like it is alive, slow, then slow again, a creature that doesn't want to be noticed. The path into the trees was barely a path. The men moved with purpose. When I picked up the audio on my recorder later, it was one of those thin, small tapes that catches more night than voice. Rustling, the scrape of canvas, someone whispering a word I couldn't make out. Then the first scream. It wasn't cinematic. It was raw and close and not meant for me. It exploded out of the dark, as if a throat had been cut open. My first instinct was to drive forward and turn on my lights and shout. My second was to call it in. I did both. I flipped to lights and radio, started toward the trees, and hit my phone with the police dispatcher number I'd been given during intake. The woman who hired me wanted the rule kept clean. She wanted the truth, not a vigilante spectacle. I spoke quickly, gave them the address, described the pickup, said, "There's a group in the woods and someone is being attacked," and then I took the corner he'd taken. What I found at the edge of that camp was a chaos you can only imagine if you have ever startled someone from their sleep, on a night that is already indifferent to them. A small encampment of tarps and sleeping bags, a fire still low in the pit. Someone had left out a battered thermos. The people there were not rich and they were not suspicious. They were just people who'd had nowhere else to keep their lives. They scattered like birds. One man stood frozen, face wet, a hand on his head where a blow had landed. Another staggered, clutching a dark jacket that had been torn. The men from the pickup were there too, circling, breathing hard. I recorded them. I snapped photos of the truck, of the license plate, of the men in masks as they shoved at people who were trying to get up. I had a duty to get evidence, not to play hero, and yet when one of the masked men lifted what looked like an axe, some other part of me, maybe the part that had watched my father show up at odd hours, started forward. I was slow, and maybe slower than I should have been. Maybe I could have shouted sooner. The men moved and the night swallowed the sound. By the time the officers arrived, 3 cars from the county and 1 patrol unit from the town, 2 of the men were already gone. The truck sat smoking a little in the cold, tailgate open, the sticker on the bumper catching the light and looking small. The officers cuffed the men who remained. There was a lot of shouting. A young woman from the camp kept saying, "They came from the road, they came from the road," as if that would make it make sense, as if a landmark could fix what had been done. The woman who hired me came down from her house when she heard what had happened. She had the look of someone whose particular problem had caromed into something she had never asked for. She put her hands over her mouth and then over her eyes. "I only wanted to know if he was cheating," she said to me, but she didn't sound like she was asking. She sounded like she was apologizing, which made my job feel suddenly obscene. Police took my statement. They took the recordings, my camera card, my notes. Evidence of someone's negligence or maybe someone's courage. These things are complicated. The local detective on the scene nodded at me once, the kind of nod that is halfway respect and halfway get out of my way. Later, over the phone, he told me arrests had been made and charges were being discussed. Whether the men walked into the woods to terrorize those people, or whether this had been organized elsewhere and simply funneled through Mark's pickup, was something they were still sorting out. There were rumors then. Mark, part of a group that targeted the homeless, a dozen city incidents over previous months. But rumor is not evidence, and the case file in my office reads indefinido on several points, where the police never reached a conclusion I could put in black ink. What stayed with me wasn't the arrest or the news feed that ran a week later. It was sitting in my car after the scene cleared and listening to the quiet. The way the woods kept a long memory. The way sleeping bags smelled like cigarette smoke and something older like surrender. I thought about the woman's voice on the phone when she said she would never have imagined this. She believed, as many people do, that surveillance is a tool for truth, and truth is neat and clear. You hand someone a piece of paper proving they were lied to, you get a dissolution of trust and life continues. That's the narrative. But what I learned in that clearing was how surveillance is also an amplifier. What you find can be a record, and records can be used by good hands or bad ones. The camera doesn't understand morality. A friend of mine, who runs a small recovery shelter, later told me that the camp never fully recovered. Some people refused to go back because of the memory, others couldn't find their things. The men arrested received arraignments, and then indefinido appears again in my notes, when the trail goes cold on whether they were part of a larger network or a local vicious cell. The client moved out 3 months later. She said she couldn't live in the house where violence had been planned, even if she hadn't known. She gave a deposition at some point. Again, my notes say indefinido, about the final civil outcomes. You learn to live with silence from the system. I should be clear. I never felt I failed because I didn't run into the dark and tackle 3 masked men. My training and the ethics of the industry, and something basic about being alive, keeps you from turning a surveillance job into a personal crusade. But I live with that night like a stone in my shoe. The stone is heavy because I watched people who had been erased by the county's margin get beaten, and for a moment my camera was the only witness to what the state might choose to ignore. We moved on to other jobs after that. The office accepted the check I brought in, and I filed the notes and I met other clients. But every once in a while, the image of the bumper sticker, small and ordinary, flashing under a cop's lights, would surface in the back of my skull. Ordinary things can be accomplices. The second case I want to tell you about involved someone I trusted, a man who left the badge and came to work under my roof for a while. He'd been a patrol officer for years and knew how to read a person by the set of their shoulders from 30 yards. He left the force for reasons that to him were bureaucratic rather than moral. He called himself practical. I called him Harris, the way most of us use nicknames as shorthand for the person before us. He brought a dry laugh to the work and a habit of lighting a cigarette when he was thinking. He learned to trade the uniform for a suit coat and a lighter workload, but he still had that tilt of professional suspicion that made him good at the job. Harris got a call from a man who wanted proof. "I need to know if she's seeing someone else," the husband said over the phone, voice tight the way men sound when they're trying not to cry. He paid cash, provided pictures, and left Harris to do his work. This was the kind of job that pays the bills. A quiet week of photographs, a few evenings that ended without incident, the slow accumulation of small legal evidence. Harris followed the woman to a hotel twice, to a cafe late at night, and took the kinds of photographs you hand to a judge if you need to make a case in divorce court. The man got what he wanted. The photos were clear, two people close together, an embrace. A room key slid across a bar, a watch left on a plate. Harris closed the file. He considered it one of those jobs where nothing extraordinary happened. He drank a beer and gave the man a folder. The man looked at the photos once, twice, and then folded them into a drawer like an answer he wasn't yet brave enough to use. Harris thought that was that. A week later, the call came. Shots fired at a residence. The dispatch had the address from our file. The husband had left the house that night to clear his head, a neighbor said, and returned with a rifle. Bullet casings were found. One of them had been lodged in a living room wall. The wife survived, but her injuries were severe. She survived, but it was the kind of survival that changes the axis of a life. The jawline, the speech altered, the way light falls on someone's face when they're measuring the world by a new safety map. We learned slowly that the husband who had hired Harris had come to believe the photos were proof of an affair that needed to be solved, not by papers in court, but by permanent action. Where the evidence ended up matters. Evidence in the wrong hands becomes an invitation. Harris went to the hospital and sat outside the wife's room for a long time. He told me later, cigarette in hand and eyes on the street, that he felt the tremor of responsibility in his bones. "We give people a tool," he said. "We give them a thing that makes their suspicion look like fact. We can't control what they bring home." He did not say, "I should have done more." What he said was quieter and worse. "I didn't see it coming." The husband was arrested at the scene. He was charged with attempted murder. That's the legal part, the part that puts a neat label on an ugly moment. The family that followed, 2 children, a complicated history of finances and apology and denial, disintegrated in ways that the law couldn't mend. The daughter later, this is where my notes turn small and thin, and the word indefinido appears in places where full truth grows slippery with time, was involved in an accident months after the shooting. Whether the accident was a direct line from the trauma at home or a cruel coincidence is something I never got a definitive answer for. Those things don't behave like math. The mother never fully recovered from either the bullet or the ways life bent afterward. The husband's moves through the court system were messy, and at some point the criminal files split from the civil ones, and the story got rationed into lines on paper and the kind of long legal lag that leaves people suspended in limbo. Harris quit a few weeks later. He told me he couldn't reconcile the idea that a folder of photos could be a match in someone else's fuse box. He took an insurance consulting job across state lines, one that didn't require him to watch people in the dark. He said the nights had crept into his sleep like small animals. He said he didn't want to keep waking up to the sound of a slammed door. The kind of guilt that comes from knowing you are an instrument in someone else's decision is a quiet, particular ache. It doesn't scream. It stays. We talked about limits after that. We debated whether we should add a clause in our contracts about use of evidence. We considered a client screening process. Mostly we drank coffee and argued, and then, like most small agencies, went back to taking the work that paid the rent. The moral questions remained, sitting in the office like unread mail. Who is responsible when evidence is misused? Is the PI a neutral observer or a participant once the camera has clicked? I bring these 2 stories up now not because they're the most colorful, but because they're representative of the steady, low-level terror that underwrites this work. There is a terror that is immediate, someone lunging at you in the dark, and a terror that is gradual. The idea that the simple act of documenting a life can funnel into someone else's violence. Both terrors tug on you. The third case is the one I've been circling for years. Of the three I told you about, this is the one that ends up at the point where you have to admit you may have stopped something worse. It's also the story that convinced me that routine can fold into catastrophe without warning. It started as a missing person job and became an investigation that touched on strange marginal obsessions, on torn pages of a notebook, and on a symbol that kept reappearing in the strangest places. His name was Joseph, Joe in my notes, and the file came to me because his sister, tired and small-eyed from months of bouncing between shelters and police stations, paid cash and asked for help. She handed me his last coherent thing, a short curt note left on the kitchen counter, nothing more than an apology and a line about needing to be somewhere else. That's a classic missing person instigation. People leave when they can't hold the pieces of their life together. We get calls like that monthly. People vanish to start over, to hide, to attempt a clean break. Lots of them are found weeks or months later, sleeping on a sofa at a cousin's or enrolled in a factory job far away. Joe at first seemed like a case you could close with patience and the slow turning of leads. He'd been steady for years, job at a plant, a few friends, a marriage that hummed along until it didn't. He left with a note, 2 shirts, and a backpack that the sister said had some odd items that didn't fit the profile. A small water-damaged book in Arabic, she didn't know what it was, and a stapled notebook with pages partly burned. There was a shop receipt with the name of a town the sister had never heard of, Greeley. A bartender in a joint called Pete's Fan Zone mentioned seeing a man who might have been Joseph leaving the bar in the early morning, talking to himself, clutching a napkin with the number 777 scribbled on it. The bartender showed Harris, a different investigator who took the lead for a time, one of those grimy napkins nearly sticking to the beer mat. When you're dealing with the missing, you sift for patterns. Last known location, people he spent time with, financial transactions, weird notes. Joe's burned notebook had lists of names that looked, at first glance, like nothing, random contacts perhaps. But a few of the names lined up suspiciously with the names of elementary schools in and around Greeley. You could say that was coincidence. You could also say, and here is where the hair on the back of your neck rises. You could say that if Joe was trying to map out institutions, that mapping took on an ominous geometry. Then there was the 777 thing. Numbers turn into symbols in certain minds. In Joe's case, the napkin with 777 could have been a joke among men in a bar, some odd superstitious code, or a finger wag at a personal myth he'd been building in his head. My friend who knows Arabic and numerology of different traditions told me, carefully and with the kind of caveat a teacher of volatile things gives, that depending on script and orientation, certain numerals can be misread or repurposed. An inverted or stylized Arabic numeral might look to a Western eye like 777, while in another hand another script, to someone who is not fluent, it could be a different number altogether. The theory that 777 is the inverse image of 666 in some stylized handwriting is something investigators bring up when trying to link symbolism to intent. It's a hypothesis. It's not evidence. We made sure to label it as such. We also wrote in the margins of our reports that an alternative explanation was that it was nothing more than a gang tag or a drunken joke. It remained in my files a question mark. Could this be a symbol of delusion, a prank, or an actual marker of some plan? I spent nights going through libraries, literal libraries, not internet forums, pulling texts, flipping pages, trying not to get lost in the fog of others' obsessions. There's a strange academic side to this work that most people don't expect. A PI becomes a part-time historian, linguist, sometimes an amateur anthropologist. When you find a clue written in a script you don't know, you must either understand it or acknowledge your ignorance. I asked a university professor for help with the book Joe had in his backpack. He told me, gently, that the book was a collection of classical texts, nothing inherently violent, but also that people have always found in books whatever they were bent on finding. A recipe can be read as a ritual if you want it to be. That's the thing about interpretation. It often tells you more about the interpreter than the interpreted. The trail took shape through small human things. A pastor named Ed, who'd had a short conversation with Joe at a shelter, said Joe had been restless and conflicted, but nothing that sounded like a plan. A bartender who'd watched Joe scribble 777 on a napkin later said he'd seen graffiti on a school in Munford Scott, names that matched the notebook list, and it made him uncomfortable. The graffiti was non-violent in its execution, numbers spray-painted in the dead of night, but it was painted on places you could not imagine without a chill, small elementary schools where children waited for buses. The pattern of 3 occurrences across different townships changed the tone in our office. That's the point where your curiosity is replaced by dread. We took that to the local sheriff. The deputy listened and made the reasonable point that gang tags and kids with spray paint crop up all the time. He told us there was no direct threat yet, and they had other, more immediate things to attend to. He filed the report. He told us to call if anything escalated. You get that response a lot from police departments that are stretched thin. Sometimes you get a detective whose jaw tightens and who follows up. Here we got a "we'll keep an eye on it" and a promise to share information. I didn't like leaving it there. I started to drive the county roads, stopping at schools, noting when the custodial crews arrived in the morning. I did not engage in surveillance of children. I asked questions about security, about whether anyone had noticed strange cars or men watching schoolyards. Most administrators shrugged. Vandalism is a pattern. A number scrawled on a wall is often a teenager's joke. But the proximity of the scribbles in places with children couldn't be dismissed entirely. And Joe, with his burned notebook and a backpack full of textbooks in a language that felt foreign to those who lived there, became a focal point for all the things you do not want to have to consider. Then I found him. It was less a cinematic moment than a flat terrible now. I was going down a side street a few blocks from where the last sighting had been reported when a man moved across the sidewalk in front of me. He walked hunched, hands in pockets, shirt collar up against the cold. The hairline of his eyes was off. The face sagged like it had been made of too soft clay. For a second, I thought it was a civilian in need. For a second, I thought it couldn't be him. Then I saw the notebook clipped to the outside of his jacket, smoke-stained and folded. He looked at me like a man who'd been expecting someone and not quite expecting me. I called his name out, "Joseph?" And he turned. The turn was calm. Calm like someone who was ready to be seen. He didn't run. He didn't reach for anything. I stepped out of my car, telling him who I was, offering the kind of small lines we use to establish presence without hostility. He smiled in a way that might have been recognition, or might have been confirmation that the curtain was about to be pulled back. He said simply, "You shouldn't have come. He shouldn't have come." I remember that line because it's the kind you hold after a while. I would later reconstruct movements, but in that instant everything tightened. He moved suddenly, faster than I expected, and I reached for the radio in my car, and then for my phone. He pulled something from the inside pocket of his jacket. At first I thought it was a bullet case, then a small metal glint. But before I could decide what it was, he raised it and fired. He fired. The shot snapped the quiet. I hit the deck, old reflexes, old iron in me, and felt a shock down my arm as something tore a thread through muscle. I remember a white-hot pain, and then a cold clarity. Someone had decided to end things in a place where others might be hurt. The world condensed to small noises, the rattle of a magazine, the fat drop of spent brass on pavement, someone shouting. I returned fire, not to kill, but to stop. We fell into a geometry of distance and recoil. There was no cinematic slow motion. There was only the terrible business of saving the possible. The community paramedics arrived like a mechanical blessing. The patrol cars answered the noise. He went down. I went with him to the pavement and watched while someone cupped a towel against a wound that had not yet bled out the last of its threat. An emergency room later stitched me back into the world, and Joe, he was older than I had imagined, was cuffed and breathing hard. In the motel room, the investigators later turned up. They found an arsenal that suggested planning, caches of ammunition, and a map with school names circled. It looked like preparation for something worse than a suicide or a run. That night I was in the hospital with my arm bandaged, and a reporter called my phone. I gave a statement. The sheriff's office called it an attempted mass attack averted, though that phrase sat in my mouth like too sweet medicine. Legally, the charges that followed were for attempted murder and weapons violations. The idea that a conspiracy existed on a scale that would have reached children remained, in legal language, tentative and prosecutorial. In my notes, I wrote down what the motel stash contained and what the notebook pages suggested. I wrote down that some pages were burned and some were intact, and that the word 777 had been reiterated in more than one place. I also wrote down the alternative possibilities. That Joe might have been under the influence of delusions fed by a textual obsession, that he might have been connected to a group, or that he was simply at the end of a rope and looking for meaning in a handful of symbols he had misread or been taught to misread. The aftermath didn't feel like victory. I had a scar on my arm and a sense that I'd been given the position of witness and actor at the same time. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and inevitability. The deputies who took his statement later told me that what they found in the stash warranted a federal interest. I said nothing. There is a part of you that becomes numb to being a small part of a larger justice machine. There is another part that will not let the trauma settle into the case-closed drawer. I was lucky in the physical sense. There are people who live through that and pay the remaining cost with loss of mobility, empty chairs at dinner, or worse. I was lucky enough to come home and to have stitches that would form a thin groove of memory down my arm. I came back to the office and tried to write the report the way we're taught to write reports, plainly, chronologically, with facts separated from opinion. I did my best to mark speculative lines as hypothesis and to flag the Arabic numerals discussion as something that required specialist testimony. It is an odd career when your life becomes footnotes. That's where I'll stop for now. Sitting at my desk with a thinned-out notebook, a scar and a sheriff's report that reads like a cautionary tale. There are hearings in the future, and a legal calendar that will decide what art of meaning is imposed on Joe's actions, whether they were politically motivated, the product of untreated mental illness, or something we as investigators missed. For now, the motel is cleared, the school's got extra locks on some doors, and the notebook is in evidence under a number that will be called in court. The people whose lives were most at risk are safe, at least for the present. What ties these cases together, what makes them most terrifying to us who do this work, is not simply the violence of a single night. It is the realization that ordinary human fragments, a napkin, a sticker, a set of photos, can become the hinge points for catastrophe when they intersect with fragile minds or malicious intent. It is also the knowledge that what we gather can be a shield, or it can be fuel. And finally, it is the cost to those who bear witness. The nights you can't sleep because a scream finds you, the conversation you have with a client who wanted only a truth and whose life tilts into ruin, the colleagues who leave the trade because their hands are shaking too much to hold a camera. There are legal proceedings to follow. There are families whose futures were altered. There is, in the corner of my office, the file still stamped indefinido, where patterns are unresolved and where I return when the nights are long. There are calls to take and calls to make. There is always one more case. The days after the shooting folded into a calendar of small, sharp obligations. There were interviews to give, reports to finish, a pile of paperwork whose edges stung like paper cuts. The motel room and its contents went into evidence. Photos were catalogued, serial numbers logged. The sheriff's office passed a binder across the table that smelled faintly of the duct tape they'd used to secure a box. A federal agent with a clipped voice asked questions that sometimes felt like they were trying to frame a narrative into neat federal statutes. The local DA's office requested copies of everything we had: the motel ledger, the burned pages, the napkins scrawled with 777, the photos from the night before Joe's arrest. Where the police had a timeline, the prosecutors wanted motive. Where the defense wanted to place blame on mental illness, the victims and their families wanted clarity. That clarity never came neatly. A court calendar was set. Joe was arraigned and pleaded not guilty, his lawyer requesting psychiatric evaluation. The evaluation was thorough, handled by a team of doctors who spoke slowly and in measured sentences about psychosis, obsession, and the trouble that comes when a person layers meaning onto accidental patterns. The court ordered competency hearings. The forensic reports arrived in thick, clinical envelopes. Some passages in those reports were precise. blood alcohol levels, medical histories, medication lists. Other passages were hedged with phrases like indefinido and no definitive causal link established. Those words, inked in the margins of a file, felt heavier than the longer declarative sentences. Indefinido was the legal equivalent of a scar that might never flatten. At trial, the prosecution laid out the sequence we had reconstructed. The notebook, the burned pages, the motel stash. They showed the map with school names circled. They played recordings from the motel phone calls and the dispatch tapes. The defense countered with testimony about Joseph's mental state. Depression, voices heard in isolation, obsessions that escalated, and with expert witness statements that suggested his interpretation of symbols like 727 had been intensely personal, not part of an organized terror plot. The expert on Arabic script testified that some stylizations could be misread if the reader was not practiced. The effect of that testimony was to complicate, not to simplify. The jury heard about spray-painted numbers on school walls, and they also heard that the custodial staff cleaned them off before parents saw them. They heard about the stash of ammunition, and also testimony that some of it could have been planted by collectors or merely accumulated. How something that looks like intent can in the wrong context look like nothing at all. The legal conclusion, the one the public wanted the most, became a slow-motion negotiation between different kinds of truth. The DA weighed the prospect of a jury conviction against the likelihood of a successful insanity defense and the desire to protect children and public spaces. The public narrative wanted a villain. The forensic narrative wanted evidence. The truth we assembled sat somewhere between those frames. When the trial finally moved forward, the outcome read in court transcripts as procedural and technical. Charges adjusted, hearings postponed, pleas considered. Where I needed a strong narrative, the legal system delivered appendices and continuances. In my notes at multiple points, I again wrote the shorthand that had come to mean the space between what we knew and what we hoped the law could prove. Indefinido. That ambiguity, however, did not erase the real-world outcomes. Schools tightened pickup areas. One school district installed cameras at entrances they'd never had funds for before. Another charter hired an off-duty officer to patrol during arrival and dismissal. Parents who had been complacent about locks and sign-in sheets suddenly asked about active shooter drills and evacuation times. That new vigilance felt like a fragile, necessary armor. It was also a public cost. Money spent on security, teachers distracted by drills, children kept from playgrounds, while administrators debated emergency protocols. The community, whose daily life had not asked to be part of our investigation, paid for the prevention anyway. Joe's family moved into the bright, disorienting world that families of defendants and victims know well. Visitations, attorney conferences, sympathetic neighbors, and fewer friends. His sister came to an early hearing and sat with her hands folded over a coffee that went cold. She had been the one who hired me, the one who'd left the water-damaged Arabic book and the backpack with 2 shirts on my desk, and said simply, "He's not himself." After the arrest, she visited the evidence room to see the notebook in its plastic sleeve. She cried in the corridor outside the holding cell and later told me, when we spoke privately, that the police had asked her things she couldn't answer, and that sometimes she felt like the person she had hired to help had become, in some small way, part of the machine that took her brother away. There is a particular culpability that families carry when someone they love is violent or accused of violence. It is a shared grief and a small, corrosive shame. The men arrested in the Woods case, what I called the Mark Tale, faced arraignment too. The local papers ran follow-ups that named the charges in bare bullet points. The shelter into which the homeless people of that clearing had once folded did fundraising to re-establish a site with better lighting and an organized roster. My client from the house moved away, and sometimes I would catch a headline that suggested the men had been convicted, and sometimes the headline softened into indefinido, bated pause on conviction, plea deals negotiated, charges reduced, or even dropped where witnesses could not be coaxed back into statements. Witnesses who live on the street are often the most vulnerable to being intimidated or simply moved along by the pressures of survival. Their testimony, while morally clear in its horror, is legally fragile. The law requires a kind of permanence that poverty often makes impossible. Again, indefinido threaded itself through reports and headlines. The second case, the husband who used photos as a fuse, left a different set of residues. Harris, the ex-cop, was still home when the sentencing for the attempted murder occurred. The husband had been convicted of some charges, but the civil suits that might have created a space for restitution rolled forward at a snail's pace. The mother of the children kept custody, but with a complicated, brittle anger that had nowhere neat to go. Harris found himself in mediation rooms and before ethics boards, explaining what his office had done and what the father had done with the evidence. The meetings were polite and in some ways pointless. Two systems holding two different kinds of accountability that never seemed to intersect in satisfying ways. Harris stayed out of investigative work. He took the insurance job out of state and left the cigarettes behind more from habit than victory. I still hear from him sometimes, a short email or a pager-style text. He's older now, quieter. His voice on the phone admits to a small daily grief. It's not about a single moment. It's about the slow accumulation of other people's ruin in your hands. "We were instruments," he said once, and then, "Which instrument you are depends on the hand that holds you." The moral calculus of our work is not something you settle once. It keeps arriving like bills, due unexpectedly. Back at the office, we tried to translate those bills into policy. We drafted a clause to add to client contracts, language that warns about the limits of what evidence can do, and a line that says, "We will not participate in or facilitate violent retaliation." We updated intake forms to ask about prior violent incidents and the client's access to weapons. We did not erect a moral firewall that stopped bad things from happening. We tried to make it a little harder for clients to use what we found as a match for their anger. Those measures were imperfect and voluntary, and to some, cold bureaucracy. Yet even small structural changes felt like a response worth making. We also began to record, in more exact terms, how we handled chain of custody, so that evidence wouldn't end up in the wrong hands as easily. Those procedural changes were pragmatic. They did not cure what happened, but they tightened the seams. On a personal level, the recovery was slow. The scar on my arm grew into a line I trace with a thumb when I think too long about a night. I began to sleep less and to wake earlier, a small animal of vigilance living in me. Some nights I would hear a car door slamming in the middle of the night, and my heart would run to that bare, immediate panic that in the worst parts of the job is a daily currency. I saw a therapist because I didn't want the nights to calcify into behaviors that made it impossible to do anything else. Therapy taught me to label reactions, hypervigilance, startle reflex, survivor's guilt. It also gave me tools that were not heroic, breathing techniques that felt foolish at first, schedules that required me to be somewhere by a set time, simple boundaries around how many hours of work I'd take in a week. Not every colleague did what I did. Some stayed the course and hardened, some left. There is a pattern in private investigation that mirrors the rotation of troops. Some become veterans, others move on once the sleep evaporates. We lose people to the same slow attrition that catches up with any profession that sits in daily contact with trauma. Some take jobs in corporate fraud teams where the stakes are different. Some go into security consulting, where the adrenaline is less punctuated by human tragedies. A few started non-profit work supporting victims. That variation is a kind of grief with options. The moral question became practical in ways I had not expected. After the Joe case, parents from 3 school districts asked to come to our office and talk about the signs of extremism, of radicalization, of isolation. They wanted guidance without panic, direct answers without fear. I did my best to explain what investigators could and could not do. I told them that a napkin with numbers on it does not always map directly to a massacre. I also told them not to dismiss patterns. Graffiti that repeats at schools across multiple towns is worth a call. Those lines, between paranoia and prudence, are the ones we get paid to walk every day. People thanked me in ways that felt like absolution, and other times felt like a renewed ledger of obligations I hadn't asked to keep. In court, one of the witnesses, an elementary school principal, told a small panel how a nighttime spray paint incident in a school playground had later been tied, in the staff's minds, to the investigation. She said they had strengthened lighting and established a parent-volunteer program for morning arrivals. She spoke with a voice of civic exhaustion that I recognized from my father's many nights on patrol. Weariness and determination braided together. The school steps were an ordinary place for ordinary people to do ordinary things, and the fact that the ordinary had been endangered clung to her words. There was also a rhetorical struggle in public conversation. The local talk show hosts asked whether we had foiled a terror plot, whether Joe was part of a larger network. Some callers demanded to know if more arrests were coming. The sheriff appeared on a broadcast and said they were investigating leads. The federal interest the deputies had hinted at earlier became a part of the public narrative. Their presence lent the idea of national scope to what might have been a local tragedy. While the investigations trickled on, I worried that the narrative of thwarted apocalypse would obscure the more subtle harms: a sister who had to testify, a shelter whose residents would not return, a child whose life had been upended by a night meant to sharpen a suspicion. 3 months after the shooting, I sat with Joe's sister in a courthouse corridor while a clerk shuffled papers. She had a stack of photocopies. Some were the motel ledger, some were the forensic reports. She told me that she had learned words she never wanted to know: incapacity, competency, insanity. She asked quietly whether the books her brother had carried might have been his way of finding a place in something bigger than himself, and whether that made them guilty by association. I told her honestly that a person can find anything in a book they are already bent to discover. I told her that the book itself had no motive. She folded her hands and said, "So what are we supposed to do with that?" She wasn't asking me for legal advice. She was asking for a moral scaffolding to hold her grief. We did what we could. We provided the sister with a list of victim support resources. We shared contact information for local counselors who worked with families of the accused. We offered to sit in on meetings with the DA. Those actions did not erase consequence, but they were small practices that acknowledged responsibility beyond evidence gathering. In the worlds where legal systems and human suffering overlap, small gestures sometimes matter more than they should. As the months passed, the press releases lessened and the nights became less taut. Joe's trial proceeded with boxed lunches and lawyers pacing like caged animals. The jurors left in bows of anonymity, and the judge read instructions that sounded like formal incantations against overinterpretation. In the end, the court entered a verdict that would be recorded in public files I can reference, but still not fully reconcile in my private ledger. Indefinido is still the closest, honest shorthand for whether the court's resolutions satisfied the moral questions the case raised. For some people, the verdict produced relief. For others, it produced rage. For everyone involved, it produced some measure of partial justice and some measure of incompleteness. Walking back to my car after one final hearing, I bumped into an old friend from the shelter world who had been instrumental in the first case. She wore a heavy coat and a face that had softened with a kind of tired grace. She told me that, in light of the attention the cases had brought, a local coalition had formed to lobby the county for better services for people experiencing homelessness. That coalition had secured funding for portable sanitation units and a small outreach team. She smiled with a ragged kind of victory and asked me almost rhetorically what I had learned from watching these events unfold. "What I learned," I told her, "is that evidence is a prism. You aim light through it, and whatever is on the other side depends on the angle." She laughed, a short, incredulous sound, and said I had a way with metaphors. I said nothing about the nights or the scar or the way I sometimes woke up with the taste of iron in my mouth. She held my gaze for a second and then squeezed my forearm. That small human touch was more honest than any courtroom testimony. Professionally, the office changed. We tightened contracts. We added an intake question about prior violent histories and required a simple attestation that clients understood the limitations of evidence. We put in writing that we would refuse work that we believed had a high likelihood of being used to harm others. These measures were not dramatic, but they were useful. We did not become moral police. We became slightly more self-aware of the ways our work could be co-opted. Privately, I found the space to say no more often. Refusing a check from someone smoldering with resentment felt like a small ethical firewall. It also felt like survival. You cannot be the conscience for 100 people at once. You can only be the conscience you carry in your own hands. Saying no preserved a part of that conscience. There is one practical thing that haunts me still. It's not the motel stash or the burn marks or the napkin with 7 and 77. It's a photograph I took on an ordinary surveillance night months before everything escalated. An image of a small campfire where a man had left a thermos and a dented can. In the corner of the frame, out of focus, was a flyer for an overnight warming center. The two objects in the same frame felt like a moral injunction, the built-in defiance of neglect and the visible evidence of an infrastructure that was failing. That photograph sits in a folder now labeled indefinito because it suggests causes that the criminal calendar never addressed. Social systems failing to protect people at the margins. It's a reminder that terror and neglect are often neighbors. There are practical consequences for those of us who stayed. The younger investigators I mentored learned to write better chain of custody forms. We held a small in-office seminar with a local clinical psychologist who talked to staff about vicarious trauma and about healthy boundaries. We opened the office some evenings pro bono for families who needed help navigating police reports and court dates. Those acts don't make for interesting headlines, but they change how a community functions in the long arc. When I think about the phrase most terrifying, I no longer imagine a single monstrous act. Terrifying to me now means the way ordinary objects, photos, a napkin, a battered book, can become the pivot points of a life. It means the way a neighborhood can be altered by a single night. It means the moral weight of bearing witness and the small, bitter calculus of what doing nothing means. Terrifying is not only the shot fired in a street. It is the slow erosion of trust, the way a mother measures how safe a house feels by the absence of sounds, the way a shelter closes its doors for a month because the people inside are too afraid to return. As for me, I still take cases, but with filters. I vet the reasons people come to me. I ask about weapons. I sometimes refuse a retainer and tell a client to talk to a counselor instead. My work has become less about proving an affair and more about managing risk. Risk to people, risk to communities, risk to my own soul. I have not abandoned the trade. I have learned painfully that to know is both a privilege and a burden. Once, years ago, my father said to me over a chipped cup of diner coffee, "You'll find out quickly whether you can sleep with what you know." He had the look of someone who'd watched a city keep moving while it stitched people back together. He was right. The work exacts a cost, and sometimes the ledger never balances. But the ledger is not only about losses. It is also about the small things you can do. Testimony that keeps a dangerous person off a bus route, an extra lock on a school door, a referral to a counselor that keeps someone from sliding into worse places. Those small acts are the gravity that keeps the rest of us from tipping. I still carry an unease when I pass a park at night. I still check the rearview mirror reflexively. I still sometimes listen for a scream that is not there. And I still answer the phone when someone calls with a note left on a kitchen counter or a backpack with old books. Because despite everything, the job is about being present for moments when ordinary people need someone to be present with them. If you followed along this long, you probably came for the story and stayed for the view from the other side. The work we do as private eyes when quiet curiosity becomes urgent alarm. It's not glamorous, it's often not clean, but it matters. Evidence can save lives when wielded properly, and it can be misused when turned into vengeance. That duality is the closest thing to a rule I have learned. If you have a story like this, something you witnessed, something you were hired to investigate, something that left you sleepless, send it to the address in the description. I read the mail. If what you heard here matters to you, subscribe and consider supporting the channel so we can keep bringing true on-the-ground accounts from people who were there. Thank you for listening.